There's a question that animation fans have been debating for years, a question that seems simple on the surface, but once you actually start digging into it, it reveals two fundamentally opposing worldviews. Disney and Studio Ghibli both create unforgettable villains, but they do not do the same thing with them. And that difference is not just a matter of style or tone. It is a deep philosophical disagreement about what evil actually is, where it comes from, and what we are supposed to do with it. Today, we are going to take the time to really understand why. We will break down the most iconic villains from both studios, look at what each approach says about human nature, and by the end, answer the real question. Not just who writes better villains, but what each way of writing them teaches us about ourselves. And I will warn you right now, once we have talked through all of this, you will never watch these films the same way again. Let's start with Disney. Because honestly, nobody does a villain quite like Disney. From the first blast of their signature theme, from the first green flame or the first low, theatrical laugh, you know exactly what you're in for. Disney villains are externalized evil, bold, dramatic, often hilarious, and always written to be defeated. Take Scar. He's a Shakespearean-level villain. His bitterness, his jealousy, his manipulative charm, all of it builds one of the darkest narrative arcs in Disney history. He is corrupt to his core. He betrays, he lies, he kills. And when he finally falls, it's cathartic. The hero reclaims his throne, justice is served, and the sun rises over the Pride Lands. How did you feel when Scar fell to his death at the end of that film? Relief, right? Justice. The world was set right again. And that is exactly what Disney wants you to feel. But here's what's genuinely brilliant about how Scar is written, and it's something people don't analyze enough. Notice what he never does. He never gives you a single moment where you might find any legitimacy in his perspective. His motivations are crystal clear. His methods are completely indefensible, and his defeat feels inevitable because it feels right. That's a very precise and very deliberate narrative construction. And then there is Gaston. Gaston is fascinating for an entirely different reason. He starts out as comedy, the handsome, self-obsessed jock who is pretty harmless but deeply annoying. And then, as the film goes on, that charm slowly curdles into something far more unsettling. Gaston does not want to rule the world. He is not after some cosmic power. He just wants Belle. When she says no, his ego simply cannot process it. His entire villain arc flows from a single rejection. What makes Gaston genuinely terrifying is precisely how human he is. He does not start out evil. He becomes evil when he loses control. In the real world, we recognize this type. We have seen it, sometimes far too often. He is a man who hears no as a challenge rather than an answer. In real life, that has very concrete consequences. Frollo follows a similar logic, pushed even further. Consumed by lust and religious fanaticism, convinced of his own righteousness while being one of the most monstrous characters Disney ever created, Frollo is terrifying because he actually exists. Not as a fictional character, but as a human type. The kind of person who commits horrible acts while convincing themselves they are on the side of God. Maleficent, on the other hand, is pure aesthetic evil. She curses an infant because she was not invited to a party. What is brilliant in her design is that her look alone tells you everything you need to know. The green flames, the dramatic horns, that iconic silhouette. She is the visual embodiment of something ancient, powerful, and absolutely not to be messed with. And there is something genuinely funny about her level of commitment. She curses a baby at a solemn ceremony and then waits 16 years for the payoff. That is spectacular dedication to a remarkably petty act of revenge. From a pure narrative standpoint, Disney villains are masterclasses in efficiency. Scar establishes his entire arc in a single song. Maleficent reveals her true nature through her design alone. These characters carry enormous emotional weight with minimal screen time because they are built as instantly recognizable archetypes. And even in Disney's more recent films, where the writing gets a bit more subversive, like Hans in Frozen or Bellwether in Zootopia, the underlying idea stays the same. The villain is an obstacle, someone to beat. There are a few notable exceptions, like John Silver in Treasure Planet, who is personally one of my favorite Disney antagonists ever, and by far the most Ghibli-esque villain in the entire Disney canon. But characters like him are extremely rare, and that's not an accident. It is a deep cultural choice. Disney's storytelling roots are Western, grounded in a Judeo-Christian understanding of morality where good and evil are binary, clearly defined, and in permanent conflict. Evil disrupts the order of the world, and the story ends when that evil is destroyed. It is a worldview where justice equals punishment, and peace is restored by eliminating the villain. And this approach genuinely matters, especially in children's media. In a world where evil can often feel abstract, systemic, or impossible to clearly identify, Disney offers something invaluable: the promise that evil can be recognized, confronted, and defeated. That's reassuring. There is an emotional clarity in that kind of storytelling that is powerful and completely legitimate, but that simplicity comes at a cost. Because Disney villains, as iconic as they are, almost never genuinely evolve, they do not reflect the protagonist's own internal struggles, and they rarely invite us to see ourselves in them. They are designed to be hated and to entertain, not to make us think. The stories they inhabit are therefore stories about defeating evil, not understanding it. And that's exactly where Studio Ghibli enters with a radically different philosophy. Ghibli, in reality, does not really believe in evil the way Disney does. In many of its films, the word villain does not even quite apply. Instead of villains, Ghibli creates antagonists, misunderstood characters who are flawed, complex, emotionally layered, and in tension with others, with nature, and with themselves. Take Lady Eboshi in Princess Mononoke. She is introduced from the beginning as the main antagonist. She destroys forests, fights spirits, and clashes with sand. But she also shelters lepers, and she is the only person who has treated them as full human beings. She gives jobs to marginalized women, and she builds a community where outcasts are treated with dignity. She is not evil. She is pragmatic, ambitious, and her beliefs evolve over the course of the film. While you watch Princess Mononoke, you regularly find yourself questioning whether you are even supposed to be rooting against her. And that is entirely intentional. Yubaba in Spirited Away is another brilliant example. She is greedy, controlling, and genuinely terrifying at times. But she also honors her contracts. She cares for her enormous baby with real tenderness, and she never truly acts out of pure malice. If you look at her decisions objectively, they are calculated business moves, not acts of evil. She embodies a corrupt system, not a corrupt soul. And that distinction is enormous. And then there is the Witch of the Waste in Howl's Moving Castle. She begins as a terrifying, vengeful, and powerful sorceress. Then she loses her powers and becomes a confused, fragile old woman. Rather than being punished for her past actions, she is welcomed into Howl's home, given tea, and taken care of. The very people she tried to harm treat her with kindness. There is no punitive justice. There is compassion. That is genuinely unsettling the first time you watch it, because it does not match what we are conditioned to expect narratively. And No Face in Spirited Away pushes this logic even further. He initially seems clearly menacing. He swallows people and creates chaos. But in reality, he is just lost. No Face is not evil in himself. He reflects the greed that surrounds him. He is a blank slate, a being with no identity of his own, easily shaped by whatever environment he finds himself in. When Chihiro removes him from that toxic atmosphere, he becomes gentle, helpful, almost endearing. He was never really evil. He was simply shaped by what the world brought out of him. And that is the heart of Ghibli's philosophy. Evil is not innate. People are formed by their environment, not born bad. They become destructive when they are wounded or desperate. They become something else when they are seen, accepted, and loved. This philosophy draws from Shinto and Buddhist traditions, where morality is not binary, but a spectrum. Balance matters more than victory, and stories focus on transformation rather than punishment. In this worldview, suffering is at the root of destructive behavior. The appropriate response to evil is not punishment, it is compassion. Not because the behavior is acceptable, obviously, but because understanding its source is the only real way to prevent its continuation. From a purely narrative standpoint, this approach allows for something Disney genuinely cannot afford to offer: unpredictability. With Disney, you know the big villain will do bad things and ultimately lose. The arc is predictable because it is structurally required by that type of story. With Ghibli, you have no idea what will happen to the antagonist. They might be redeemed. They might remain morally ambiguous until the end. They might disappear without any real resolution. They might become the hero's most valuable ally. All of these possibilities make the viewing experience fundamentally richer and far more surprising. These philosophical differences produce two radically different narrative messages. Disney's message, stated plainly, is this: here is the bad guy, beat them, be better. Ghibli's message is this: here is someone in pain, understand them, be kind. Both are beautiful in their own way, but they teach us very different things. Disney villains tell us who we fear and who we blame. In the Disney universe, that fear is always external to the protagonist. The villain is someone else, somewhere else, someone we can unite against. That is comforting, but it can also reduce the genuine complexity of life and human behavior to something dangerously simple. Ghibli forces us to sit with discomfort. The antagonist might be someone the hero has to learn to coexist with, or to forgive, or worse, someone the hero risks recognizing in themselves. Conflict does not always end with justice. Sometimes it ends with compromise, with uneasy coexistence, or with nothing at all. That is a truth about life that Disney will never show you. So objectively, WHO writes better villains. The honest answer is that it depends on what you want from a story. If stories should entertain, inspire, and provide emotional release, Disney villains are superior. They are more fun, more memorable, and more satisfying to watch fall. If stories should challenge us, complicate us, and reflect reality, Ghibli antagonists are better. They are more realistic, more intellectually rewarding, and far more applicable to actual life. But here is what I genuinely think. The best stories need both approaches. Evil that is both clear and fun, but also complex and misunderstood. There are a handful of characters in animation history who managed to combine the two. Zuko from Avatar, The Last Airbender, is a perfect example. He starts as a classic antagonist, angry, obsessive, sometimes almost ridiculous in his pettiness. Then, season by season, you begin to understand the actual layers and depth of this person. You realize he is just a wounded kid trying to find his place in the world. His arc from villain to hero is precisely what makes him one of the most beloved characters in the entire history of animated storytelling. He carries the emotional clarity of a Disney villain and the psychological depth of a Ghibli antagonist. Both studios have genuine value. Disney villains teach us about courage, resistance, and moral clarity. They give us satisfying endings. And sometimes, that is exactly what we need. But Ghibli antagonists give us something else, something deeper. They remind us that evil is not always a maniacal laugh echoing through a dark castle. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is just a different perspective from our own. And maybe that is the real genius of both approaches taken together. Disney teaches us to recognize when evil needs to be confronted. Ghibli teaches us to recognize when it needs to be understood, and we need both: the clarity to know when to fight, and the wisdom to know when to listen. The courage of Disney heroes, and the compassion of Ghibli characters. Because when you get down to it, the real power of a villain might not be in how terrifying they are. It is in what they reveal about us. about the systems we live inside, about what we fear, and about what we still refuse to understand. So tell me in the comments which villain, Disney or Ghibli, has stayed with you the most. And do you think we actually need both types of villain to have truly complete stories? I read everything, and let's keep this conversation going down below.